I found the reference to it while looking for something else. I was tracing the administrative history of California's early conservation movement, trying to understand why the official account of Big Basin's founding celebrates saving the redwoods, but never specifies what the surveyors actually measured. The answer should have been in the Board of Forestry's 1902 filing, a field notebook, measurement pages, a hand-drawn map. The notebook is there, mostly. The measurement pages are not. The field map is not. And in the notebook's interior section, several pages have been cleanly removed, not torn. That is where this investigation begins. The California Board of Forestry was established in 1885, partly in response to alarm about how quickly the state's timber reserves were disappearing. By 1900, the logging industry had moved through Humboldt and Mendocino counties at a pace that stripped entire hillsides within a single decade. The coast redwood, Sequoia sempervirens, grows to heights and diameters that no other conifer on the continent approaches. It is also commercially valuable in ways that made the industry indifferent to its scale. Straight-grained, rot-resistant and manageable once felled, redwood lumber built the houses of San Francisco and the railroad ties of the Central Pacific. The forests that produced it were measured in board feet, not centuries. Big Basin sits at the southern end of the coast redwood range, in the Santa Cruz Mountains, approximately 25 miles from the coast. By the 1890s, the groves farther north had already taken the heaviest cutting, closer to mill infrastructure, deeper in supply. Big Basin remained largely uncut, not because anyone had decided to protect it, but because the economics of extraction hadn't yet reached it. That changed at the end of the decade. Mills began moving south. Logging roads appeared in the foothills. The trees at Big Basin had entered the planning horizon. In May 1900, a photographer named Andrew Hill travelled to Big Basin to document the old growth for a newspaper. The hotel owner where he stayed claimed rights to the photographs. Hill organised in response. The Sempervirens Club, named for the species, formed within months, drawing together scientists, journalists and citizens who argued that the grove should be preserved. Their petition reached the California legislature. Governor Henry Gage signed the bill creating California Redwood Park on June 19, 1902. The park encompassed approximately 3,800 acres of the Big Basin Grove and placed it under state protection. That is the story in every account of Big Basin's founding. It is documented, largely accurate, and told with justifiable pride. I was looking for something simpler when I found the gap. Why the official account celebrates saving the redwoods but never specifies what the surveyors measured. Here is what it does not address. What happened in the grove during the months between the petition campaign and the protection order, the period when the state needed to understand exactly what it was acquiring, what the timber inside it was worth, and what, if anything, made the trees there different from the redwoods already being logged to the north. Before the protection order took effect, someone had to measure what it was protecting. A timber survey is a precise undertaking. In 1902, California surveyors working for the Board of Forestry followed a standardized protocol. They measured circumference at breast height, approximately 4.5 feet off the ground, recorded the figure, and applied a standard formula to estimate both the age of the tree and the usable board feet it represented. They noted the condition of the trunk, evidence of fire damage, hollow sections, unusual growth patterns. They mapped the positions of significant trees relative to fixed landmarks, ridge lines, streams, property markers. The resulting documents, a field notebook and a separate set of measurement pages, were filed with the board and copied to state records. The surveyors who entered Big Basin in the spring of 1902 were not naturalists. They were there to produce numbers. The early portions of the surviving field notebook suggest they did exactly that, methodically, without evident excitement. The grove's outer sections contain entries consistent with what surveyors recorded elsewhere. Large trees, impressive by any measure, but within the range of what coast redwoods produce in old-growth conditions. Circumferences of 40, 45, sometimes 50 feet at breast height. Fire scars on many trunks. The standard notation for hollow interiors, which in redwoods often result from fires that burned inside the tree's base long before the living tree reached its current size. Here is what matters for understanding what the surveyors encountered next. Coast redwoods survive fire in ways that most conifers do not. Their bark, up to a foot thick in old specimens, resists burning. When fire penetrates the base of a trunk, It often burns out the interior while leaving the outer shell and the cambium layer intact. The tree continues to grow. Over decades and centuries, the hollow burn chamber inside an old redwood can reach dimensions that surprise people encountering them for the first time. Chambers large enough to stand inside, called goose pens, are documented throughout Big Basin. In 1902, surveyors would have recorded these as fire damage, a standard notation with no particular implication for commercial value, since the outer wood remained sound. The grove's interior and the section farthest from the ridge access trails, where the oldest trees in Big Basin concentrate, presented the surveyors with something different. Consider the math. The oldest verified coast redwood specimens in California have been aged at approximately 2,000 years. A tree that began growing in the 1st century CE would have been about 1,800 years old when the surveyors measured it in 1902, old enough that no living person had ever seen it as a young tree, old enough that the formula the Board of Forestry used for aging specimens wasn't designed to handle it. Above a certain diameter, the standard calculation for estimating age from circumference breaks down, not because the formula is wrong, but because the trees it was designed to measure don't grow that large. The surveyors noted at least 2 trunks where the circumference measurement required the 2-man tape technique to be repeated, because the initial figure seemed incorrectly recorded. It was not incorrectly recorded. The ground around those trunks was also unusual. Root buttresses in coast redwoods are well documented. The base of the trunk flares outward at ground level, creating raised ridges that extend several feet in all directions. In the grove's interior, the surviving notebook describes formations that extend farther than the surveyors expected, with raised circular mounds between adjacent trees that suggested, as one notation puts it in language slightly outside standard survey vocabulary, a shared subsurface structure. The surveyors were describing something the formula didn't account for, and the vocabulary didn't quite fit. It was at this point, approximately 2/3 through the notebook in the section dated to the grove's oldest interior, that the lead surveyor drew a circle around a measurement, wrote something in the margin, and used a notation that appears nowhere else in the document. The notation read, "Too large to cut." Too large to cut was not a preservationist phrase. In 1902 California timber practice, the designation had a specific logistical meaning, a trunk whose diameter at the base exceeded the capacity of the mill's splitting equipment to process cleanly. The large diameter limit for commercially viable coast redwood cutting at the time was roughly 16 feet across, approximately 50 feet in circumference. Trees above that threshold required equipment modifications, additional labour, and time that often made extraction unprofitable. The notation was practical. It appeared in Board of Forestry survey records elsewhere in the Redwood Range. It was not unusual. What was unusual was finding it clustered. In the Big Basin survey notebook, the notation appears in the interior section, on consecutive entries, not isolated trees scattered across the grove, but several trunks in close proximity. The notebook's legibility in this section is uneven. Portions have faded or been damaged, but the clustering is visible. The surveyors were not flagging individual oversized specimens one by one. They were working through a section where the oversized specimens were the rule, not the exception. What the surveyors recorded in the notebook's outer sections was ordinary. What they recorded in the interior was not. The field map was drawn during this phase of the survey. In 1902, California Timber Survey field maps were hand-drawn on standard drafting paper and submitted alongside the measurement pages as part of the official filing. They recorded tree positions relative to fixed landmarks, ridgelines, streams, property markers, and used standard symbols for species, condition, and designation. A circle around a symbol indicated a flagged tree. Multiple circles in the same area indicated a flagged zone. The Big Basin map, when submitted, would have been the official record of exactly which trees the state was protecting and what distinguished them from the rest of the grove. Here is what I keep coming back to. The Big Basin field map, as referenced in the Board of Forestry's 1902 administrative correspondence, showed something beyond the standard symbols. The correspondence, a single letter, filed in the California State Archives under board records for that year, notes that the map contained formations not consistent with standard survey notation, and that clarification from the field team had been requested. What formations? The letter does not say. Whether the clarification was ever provided is not recorded. What is recorded is that the field map was submitted with the survey materials in the late spring of 1902. After that, the archive record goes quiet. The phrase, "formations not consistent with standard survey notation," is the only external confirmation, outside the notebook itself, that the surveyors encountered something in the grove's interior their standard vocabulary could not accommodate. The person who wrote that letter was describing a map that showed something the form didn't have a category for. What that something was is not in the record. The clarification the board requested was apparently never filed. The measurement pages, the separate document set that would have contained the specific circumference figures, height estimates, and board foot calculations for every flagged tree, are not attached to the field notebook in the California State Archive's current holdings. They are not filed separately under the Big Basin Survey Index. They are not cross-referenced in the Board of Forestry's 1902 biennial report, which mentions the Big Basin survey in passing but provides no figures. The measurement pages have not been located in any subsequent archival review. The field map is also absent. The California State Archive's Index of 1902 survey maps, compiled in a 1974 finding aid, lists entries for 11 surveys conducted that year. Big Basin is listed. Its field notebook is cited. The measurement pages are noted as not located. The field map entry reads, "Map submitted per correspondence, current location unknown." The protection order arrived in June 1902, the same season as the survey. The Sempervirens Club's petition had been in motion for 2 years. The legislature's action was the culmination of a documented campaign. The survey and the protection order existed on parallel administrative tracks. Under California administrative procedure, records related to state-acquired land transferred from the Board of Forestry to the new park's managing authority. The field notebook transferred. The measurement pages and the field map did not transfer, because by the time of the transfer, they were already not in the board's files. Each of these gaps is individually explainable. Measurement pages go missing in routine filing operations. Field maps are misplaced during administrative transitions. The Board of Forestry processed dozens of surveys across multiple counties in 1902, and record-keeping was imperfect by modern standards. A missing document from a single survey is, on its own, unremarkable. The board processed hundreds of timber surveys between 1885 and 1905. Not all records survived. But here is the problem. Each gap, considered alone, requires nothing more than ordinary institutional loss. Together, they require an explanation of a different kind, because the documents that survive are precisely the ones you would expect to survive if someone wanted the survey's general existence on record while its specific findings were not. The measurement pages that would have specified exactly how large the flag trees were, gone. The field map that would have shown their positions, the surrounding ground formations, and the notations the board's own correspondents found unusual enough to flag for clarification, gone. The notebook pages covering the grove's oldest interior, excised cleanly in the section where the anomalous entries appear, and the administrative correspondence that acknowledged something unusual in the map's content, a single letter preserved by apparent accident in a general filing folder rather than the survey-specific folder where it should have been. What survived is the notebook's shell, the outer sections, the standard entries, the unremarkable measurements. What did not survive are the specific records that would have answered the question the board's own correspondence raised. The Sempervirens Club's correspondence held at UC Santa Cruz describes the grove's importance and the threat from loggers. It does not describe what the surveyors found when they measured it. Not individually suspicious, individually plausible, together requiring an explanation that the archives cannot currently provide. Survey conducted, anomalies noted, map flagged by the board's own correspondence, protection order issued, measurement pages absent at transfer, field map absent at transfer, notebook preserved, minus the interior pages, not coincidence. Pattern. The men who conducted the 1902 Big Basin survey are not named in the field notebook's surviving pages. The notebook's cover, where the assigned surveyor's name would normally appear, is damaged, water-stained in a way that obscures the signature line without destroying the document. The California Board of Forestry's biennial report for 1901 to 1902 lists 4 timber surveyors on active assignment in the Santa Cruz region during that period. Cross-referencing those names against the board's personnel records, which are held at the California State Archives and partially indexed by the Online Archive of California, produces 3 of the 4 men's subsequent career histories. The 4th disappears from state employment records after the autumn of 1902, not dramatically. He simply doesn't appear in the next biennial roster. That kind of administrative disappearance is not inherently significant. Surveyors changed employers, moved to other states, retired from fieldwork. The board's annual turnover in this period was substantial. A man who doesn't appear in the 1903 roster might have left for a private timber company, or simply moved away. The record doesn't say. What the record also doesn't say is where the measurement pages were at the time he left. William Weston was appointed Big Basin's first superintendent in 1902, the same summer the park was established. He served in that role for several years, living on the grounds, and kept a series of journals now held at the California State Park's Heritage Program archives in Sacramento. The journals cover the park's early operations in considerable detail: trail construction, visitor counts, wildlife observations, storm damage. Researchers who have used them for histories of California's park system describe them as unusually thorough for the period. The journals have not been fully transcribed. The California State Parks Heritage Program's finding aid describes the Weston journals as spanning approximately 600 pages across multiple volumes. Some volumes, the finding aid notes, include references to survey-era documents and the grove's condition prior to park establishment. Those references have not been separately indexed. Reading them would require working through the full set. The Sempervirens Club's early records present a related gap. The club was the primary institutional actor in the campaign to protect Big Basin, and its correspondence from 1900 to 1910 is held at the University of California Santa Cruz Special Collections. The letters between Andrew Hill and other club members, between the club and state legislators, and between the club and the Board of Forestry are available to researchers. Several historians have used them to reconstruct the preservation campaign's political history. None of those histories engage with the survey's specific findings. What the Sempervirens Club correspondence discusses, in considerable detail, is the moral and aesthetic case for preserving the grove. The trees are ancient, the trees are irreplaceable. The logging industry, if unchecked, would destroy something that took centuries to grow. These are genuine arguments made by people who believed them, what the letters do not contain. And here is what matters, because the survey was being conducted at exactly the moment the correspondence was most active, is any reference to specific measurements. No circumference figures, no flagged trees, no mention of what the Board of Forestry's surveyors actually recorded when they went into the grove the campaign was working to protect. Why not? If the surveyors had reported anomalous findings to the board in the spring of 1902, and if Andrew Hill or other Sempervirens Club members had access to those findings through their correspondence with board officials, why does that information not appear in any of the club's letters? The absence is not proof of anything. But it is a question the archive raises and does not answer. The California WPA writers, operating under the Federal Writers Project's Weston Division in the late 1930s, interviewed elderly residents of Santa Cruz County as part of the state's life history collection. Those interviews are held at the Bancroft Library at the University of California, Berkeley. The Bancroft's finding aid for the California WPA materials covers approximately 2,300 interviews conducted statewide, organized by county. The Santa Cruz County materials include interviews with residents born as early as the 1850s, people who would have been adults in 1902, old enough to have known the surveyors, worked adjacent to the grove, or heard the survey's results discussed in the communities around it. The Santa Cruz County WPA interviews have not been fully indexed for Big Basin-specific content. This is the human chain that carried whatever the surveyors knew. Not an institutional chain, a personal one. The surveyor who flagged the trees told someone. The man who drew the field map went home that evening and said something about what he had found. William Weston, living in the grove through its first seasons, walking the interior trails past the trees the surveyors had circled, wrote something in one of those 600 pages. The elderly Santa Cruz County residents who spoke to WPA writers in the late 1930s would have been in their 30s and 40s in 1902, old enough to have absorbed what their neighbours brought back from that spring survey. The preservation story as it is told in every account of Big Basin's founding is a story about trees. The trees were magnificent. The trees were threatened. The trees were saved. It is a complete story that has the advantage of being true. What it omits is everything quantitative, Every number, every measurement, every specific description of what distinguished the grove's oldest interior from the redwood stands already being cut to the north. A person born in 1875 who had worked the Santa Cruz timber economy in 1902 would have been 75 years old in 1950, still alive, still capable of remembering what they had seen or been told. Their children, born in the 1900s and 1910s, would have grown up hearing whatever that person chose to pass on. The last Californians with any first-hand proximity to the 1902 survey were dying out through the 1940s and 1950s. The window for capturing what they knew closed without anyone working specifically to keep it open. There was, almost certainly, a woman in Santa Cruz County in the early 1950s, a woman whose father had worked that survey, or whose neighbour had, or who had heard the story told across a kitchen table by someone who knew the man who drew the map. A woman in her 60s or 70s who carried a specific piece of information about what the surveyors found in the grove's interior. Not a vague impression, but a detail, a number, a description of a formation, something precise that had been passed from the person who saw it to the person they trusted enough to tell. By 1955 she was gone, and the details she had kept for 50 years went with her, back into the grove, where the trees are still standing. The timeline of what happened to the 1902 survey's records is not subtle once you lay it out in sequence. The California Board of Forestry began systematic timber surveys in 1882, 3 years before its formal establishment, under predecessor statutes. The survey protocols it developed over the following 2 decades were standardized enough that records from different years and different surveyors can be meaningfully compared. The Big Basin survey of 1902 followed those protocols. Its existence is confirmed. Its field notebook partially survives. Its measurement pages and field map do not. June 1902. California Redwood Park established. Survey materials transferred from Board of Forestry to Park jurisdiction. The measurement pages and field map are already absent at the time of transfer. No transfer inventory lists them. 1902 to 1910. No archival review of the Big Basin survey file. The measurement pages are not reported missing. They are simply not present, and no one has yet looked for them with a specific question in mind. 1921. The California state government undergoes its first major administrative reorganization since the Progressive Era reforms. Records from multiple departments, including forestry and parks, are consolidated. Some materials transfer to the state archives, others are designated surplus and not retained. The Board of Forestry's records from the 1900 to 1910 period are among those consolidated, and the finding aids produced in subsequent decades reflect gaps that cannot always be explained by any single event. 1927. The California State Park System is formally established under the State Park Commission, absorbing California Redwood Park and dozens of other sites. Older administrative records are again consolidated. The Weston journals, Big Basin Superintendent records from 1902 onward, transfer to what will eventually become the California State Parks Heritage Program archives. They transfer as a unit, largely unexamined for content. 1974. A cataloguing project at the California State Archives produces the finding aid that currently indexes the 1902 survey records. The finding aid notes the measurement pages as not located and the field map as having an unknown current location. The person who compiled the finding aid was documenting an absence that had existed at minimum since the 1920s consolidation. Possibly since 1902, each step in this sequence has an ordinary explanation. Administrative reorganizations lose records. Transfer inventories miss items. Finding aids reflect the state of archives at a moment in time. None of it requires anything more than the routine losses that accompany institutional record-keeping across a century. What it also produces, as a practical matter, is a complete absence of the specific documents that would tell you what the 1902 surveyors recorded for the trees they mark too large to cut. Here is what the trees themselves can tell us, independent of any survey record. The coast redwoods of Big Basin are among the oldest verified living organisms on the California coast. The oldest specimens in the grove have been aged, through core samples and historical records, at approximately 1,800 years. A tree that began growing in the 1st century CE would have been about 1,800 years old when the surveyors measured it in 1902, old enough that no living person had ever seen it as a young tree, old enough that the formula the Board of Forestry used for aging specimens wasn't designed to handle it. It was old when the surveyors measured it. It was old when William Weston walked past it on his morning rounds and noted something in his journal. The root mounds the surveyors described are a documented feature of Big Basin's old-growth interior. Coast redwood roots are shallow, rarely deeper than 6 feet, but they spread laterally and interconnect with neighbouring trees, sharing nutrients and structural support across a common root zone. The raised formations between adjacent old-growth trees in the grove's interior are the surface expression of a subsurface structure that has been developing for centuries. The formations the surveyors noted in language the Board of Forestry's correspondents found unusual were not imaginary. They are there today, in the same section of the grove, visible to any visitor who walks the trail past the oldest trees and looks at the ground between their bases. The California State Archives currently holds the Board of Forestry biennial reports from 1886 through 1908. The Bancroft Library holds the Sempervirens Club correspondence and the California WPA life history interviews, including the Santa Cruz County materials. The California State Parks Heritage Program holds William Weston's 600 pages of superintendent journals. None of these collections have been cross-referenced against each other for the specific question of what the 1902 survey recorded for the grove's interior trees, where the measurement pages went, and what the field map showed that the board's own correspondents described as inconsistent with standard survey notation. That cross-referencing is still possible. The Bancroft's finding aid is searchable. The Western journals are available to researchers. The Board of Forestry biennial reports are indexed. The Santa Cruz County WPA interviews are held and catalogued. What does not yet exist is anyone who has gone through all of them with this specific question. The way those WPA writers went through the country in 1936 looking for voices before they went silent. Big Basin reopened to visitors in 2023 after 3 years of closure, following the CZU Lightning Complex fires of August 2020, which burned through approximately 97% of the park. The oldest trees in the grove's interior survived. They survived because the burn chambers inside their trunks, the same chambers the 1902 surveyors would have documented, the same formations that showed up as anomalies in the measurement record, allowed the fire to pass through the base of the tree without reaching the cambium layer that keeps it alive. The trees that are hardest to kill are the trees that have been surviving fire the longest. The measurement pages that recorded their dimensions in 1902 are still missing. The field map that showed what grew between them and beneath them has never been found. The notebook that documented the survey sits in the California State Archives, its interior pages excised, its cover damaged, its standard entries intact. And the trees are still standing in the grove's oldest section, in the same positions they occupied in 1902, their root systems connected beneath the ground, their burn chambers still visible to anyone willing to walk inside and look up. The archives don't forget. The trees don't forget. And somewhere in those unread pages, the Western journals, the WPA interviews, the board's unfiled clarification request, the record of what the surveyors measured is waiting the same way it has been waiting for a century, for someone willing to look specifically instead of walking past.